November 2, 1944. The Saar River Line, Western Germany. General Kurt von der Chevallerie is writing a report that his superiors do not want to read. A report whose professional accuracy is the specific and documented problem that the German command structure's management of its frontline commanders has been producing throughout the autumn's deteriorating situation. And he is writing it anyway. The autumn mud of the Saar-Moselle Triangle has been deepening since October, in the specific and operational way that the Western German autumn always deepens. The rains that are characteristic of this corner of Western Europe, where Germany and France and Luxembourg converge at the Saar River's confluence with the Moselle, whose October and November rains the military history of this region, documents in campaign after campaign, as the weather factor whose effect on military operations in this specific geography is not the marginal inconvenience that planners account for, but the operational constraint that converts the pace of advance from the mobile exploitation to the grinding attrition of mud-bound infantry. The rains began in early October and have been converting the roads and the fields and the defensive positions of the German forces in this sector into the specific and operational problem of a front line that is fighting not only the American 12th Corps, but the season whose conditions are making every tactical decision more difficult and every logistical calculation more precarious. Von der Chevallerie commands the LXXE Corps in this sector, has been commanding it through the specific and cascading crises of the summer and the autumn that have converted the German army on the Western Front from the coherent and professionally organized defensive force that the Atlantic Wall's construction and the strategic preparation for. The Allied invasion had been building into the improvised and understrength formation that is now holding the Saar-Moselle Triangle's defensive line, with the combination of professional competence and material inadequacy that the German army's deteriorating position in the autumn of 1944 consistently produces in every sector of the Western Front. He has been commanding since the summer's catastrophic retreats, since the collapse of Army Group B's coherent defensive line in France, and the desperate reconstitution of the German defensive position on the Western Wall, that the autumn has been building from the broken units and the replacement drafts and the improvised formations that OKW's reserve system has been scraping together from every available source in the German military's increasingly depleted reserve pool. He has been reading the reports of his divisional commanders with the specific and accumulated attention of a corps commander who has been building from the daily returns the picture of a front line whose condition the individual reports document in isolation, and whose aggregate tells the story that the individual report cannot. He has been walking the front line itself, visiting the forward positions in the rain, reading the terrain with the professional eye of a soldier who has been assessing defensive ground since the First World War's infantry campaigns taught him what a defensible position looks like, and what a position that cannot be defended indefinitely looks like when the honest assessment is applied to the material facts. He has been conducting the professional assessment of a German general whose training has given him the analytical tools to read a tactical situation honestly, and whose professional honesty, the specific and institutionally inconvenient professional honesty of a corps commander who has decided that the accuracy of the assessment matters more than its palatability to the superiors who have been preferring the assessments that confirm the official optimism, will not let him report what OKW wants to hear, when what OKW wants to hear is not what the situation is producing. The report he is writing on November 2, 1944 is the professional assessment of a front line that has been holding because the American forces opposing it have also been dealing with the autumn's supply constraints and the mud and the specific operational challenges of pressing an advance through the Lorraine Plateau's difficult terrain. Not because the German defensive position in the Saar corridor has the strength that OKW's planning is assuming it has. The report says the Saar front cannot hold through winter, cannot hold in the specific and military sense of maintaining the current line against the American pressure that the improved Allied supply situation will enable, cannot hold without the reserves whose commitment von der Chevallerie has been requesting and not receiving, cannot hold with the understrength divisions whose actual strength is a fraction of their authorized strength and whose replacement rate has been falling behind their casualty rate for months. Not if the American supply situation improves, which it will, because the Allied logistical system's capacity to accumulate fuel and ammunition is not structurally limited in the way that the current shortage suggests. Not if the American forces are reinforced and given the fuel and the ammunition and the replacements that the Allied logistical system is capable of providing when the pressure of the competing priorities on the Red Ball Express is resolved in the Saar's favor. Not without the reserves that OKW does not have, and the reinforcements that OKW will not commit, because OKW is building the reserve that the Ardennes planning requires. The report is accurate. It is also professionally dangerous in the specific and documented way of accurate reports. In 1944 Germany, whose accuracy contradicts the official optimism that the German command structure has been using as a management tool since Stalingrad. General Kurt von der Chevallerie is not a famous general in the specific and culturally significant sense that the Second World War's popular history has assigned fame to the German officers whose dramatic campaigns and whose personal charisma and whose specific military achievements have given them the biographical visibility that the war's record tends to concentrate in the commanders whose actions are most legible as individual stories. He is not the kind of German officer whose name appears in the popular histories, not a Manstein whose operational genius at Kharkov and whose relationship to Hitler's strategic direction has made him the standard reference point for the German military's professional excellence. Not a Guderian whose armored doctrine and whose panzer campaigns in France and Russia have made him the defining figure of the Wehrmacht's offensive capability. Not a model whose defensive management of the Eastern Front's crisis positions and the Western Front's autumn stabilization has given him the specific and dramatic biographical outline of the Führer's fireman who appears at the crisis and stabilizes it. He is the professional, the corps commander, the administrator of a sector of the Western Front whose defense is his specific and assigned responsibility, and whose honest assessment of the sector's defensive capability is his specific and assigned professional duty, the duty that his training and his commission and his 33 years of professional service have defined as the obligation to tell his superiors the truth about the military situation he commands, even when the truth is not the truth they wish to hear. He was born in 1891 in the German military class, whose generation will fight 2 world wars, commissioned in the Imperial German Army, in the specific and professional formation of the Wilhelmine Officer Corps, served in the First World War's staff positions and infantry commands through the war that shaped the professional formation of every German officer who commanded at the corps level in 1944, and built his career through the Reichswehr's reduced but professionally intensive interwar development and into the Wehrmacht's expansion and the campaigns that followed. He is 53 years old. He has been commanding the LXXE Corps since the summer of 1944. Through the retreat from France, whose speed and whose chaos the late summer's operations have demonstrated as the consequence of the Allied breakout's operational momentum. Through the reconstitution on the Siegfried Line, whose defensive capacity the autumn's rebuilding effort has been assembling from the broken units, and the replacement drafts, whose quality reflects the deteriorating state of the German army's replacement system. Through the autumn fighting in the Saar-Moselle Triangle, where General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps of Patton's Third Army has been pressing the German defensive position since September. He has been watching the front's condition with the professional attention of a corps commander who knows his sector in the specific and intimate way of a commander who has been in this terrain through the autumn, who knows his forces in the specific and quantitative way of a commander who reads the daily strength returns and the casualty figures and the ammunition allocation data, and who knows, with the complete and honest professional certainty of a man who has been reading this situation for 3 months, and whose reading has been confirmed by every week's operational record, that the front's defensive capability is not equal to the American pressure that a recovered Allied supply situation will produce. The Saar front in November 1944 is the expression of the German military's specific and fundamental problem on the Western Front in the autumn of 1944. The problem of a defense that must be maintained with forces whose strength has been declining since the summer's catastrophic losses in France, the losses of Army Group B's catastrophic defeat in the Falaise pocket in August. The losses of the subsequent retreat across France, whose speed has been consuming both men and equipment at rates whose replacement system has not been keeping pace, and with a logistical system whose ability to supply the front has been degrading under the Allied air interdiction, whose systematic attack on German transportation infrastructure, the railway marshalling yards and the road bridges and the fuel storage facilities, has been producing the supply shortfalls whose accumulated effect on the front line's material condition the divisional commanders are reporting, in terms whose consistency tells a story that von der Chevallerie has been assembling into his professional assessment for weeks. The divisions of the LXXE Corps are under strength. The 559th Volksgrenadier Division, the 347th Infantry Division, and the supporting elements whose assignment to the Corps' sector is covering the terrain that a full-strength corps would require more forces to defend, are divisions whose actual strength is a fraction of their authorized strength, whose artillery ammunition allocation has been declining since October, as the American air interdiction of the supply routes has produced the shortfalls whose accumulated effect is a front line that is holding on the professional competence of its soldiers and on the terrain's defensive advantages, rather than on the material strength that a sustained defense requires. The Western Wall's concrete bunkers and tank obstacles, the West Wall, whose construction in the late 1930s consumed the resources that the German military's planning had identified as the necessary investment in the permanent defensive infrastructure that would protect Germany's western border against the French offensive, whose scenario the pre-war planning assumed, and the Saar River's defensive value as a water obstacle whose crossing costs the attacker the time and the casualties that river crossings always cost, are real tactical assets that von der Chevallerie's defense is exploiting with the professional competence of a commander who understands how to use the terrain he has been given. They are not a substitute for the reserves that a coherent defensive system requires, for the counterattacks that restore lost positions when the attacker's pressure finds the weak point and exploits it before the defender can close the gap, and for the relief rotations that prevent the defensive formation's physical exhaustion from converting into the demoralization and the collapse that the American pressure is always ready to exploit when it identifies the formation that has been in the line too long and has too little left. The American force opposing von der Chevallerie's sector is General Manton Eddy's 12th Corps, the formation that has been driving east across Lorraine since the Third Army's activation in August 1944, and that has been pressing the German defensive position in the Saar-Moselle Triangle since September, with the specific and sustained pressure of a corps commander whose operational instinct is the offensive, whose experience from Tunisia through Sicily through Normandy and the Lorraine campaign has been building the professional judgment of a commander who knows how to press an advantage and whose command culture, shaped by Patton's consistent requirement for pace and for the aggressive exploitation of German defensive weakness, has been producing the steady if costly pressure that has been consuming the German defensive reserves since September, and that has been documenting, in the operational record of every week's fighting, the progressive deterioration of the German defensive position whose overall condition von der Chevallerie is reporting on November 2nd. Eddy's 12th Corps, by November 1944, includes the 35th Infantry Division, under Major General Paul Bard, a veteran formation whose fighting in Lorraine since the late summer has been producing the specific and documented casualties and the operational experience that sustained combat produces in equal measure. The 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul, which has been in the Lorraine fighting since October, and whose performance in the Saar-Moselle Triangle's difficult terrain has been establishing the operational record of a formation still building its combat experience. And the 4th Armored Division under Major General John Devine, whose reputation as the Third Army's most effective armored formation has been built in the Lorraine campaign's fighting since August, and whose operational history from Avranches through the Lorraine advance is the history of the armored exploitation's specific and successful application to the German defensive system's weak points. The 12th Corps has been moving east at the pace that the Lorraine autumn's mud and supply constraints and the German defensive resistance have jointly permitted. The pace that is not the pace of the August exploitation, but is the sustained and grinding pace of the attacker, who has the material advantage and is applying it with the professional consistency of a corps commander who understands that the tactical situation favors the patient application of force over the brilliant stroke that the terrain and the weather are not permitting. The German defensive position in the Saar corridor has been absorbing this pressure with the specific and grinding cost that sustained defensive combat at understrength produces in formations whose replacement system is not keeping pace with the losses, absorbing it in the specific way that a formation absorbs pressure that exceeds its capacity to resist it indefinitely, holding each day's position, losing each week's strength, accumulating the deficit that the replacement system's inadequacy is widening and that the reserve commitment's denial is making permanent. The question that von der Chevallerie's report is answering, the question whose answer OKW does not want to receive, because the answer's implications for the Ardennes planning's assumptions about the Saar front stability are the implications that the Ardennes planning cannot accommodate without revision, is whether the Saar front can continue absorbing this pressure through the winter. The question at the end of October and the beginning of November 1944 is not whether von der Chevallerie is right about the Saar front's condition. He is right. The divisional casualty returns confirm his assessment. The ammunition shortage data confirms his assessment. The replacement rate figures confirm his assessment. The operational record of every week's fighting since September confirms his assessment. The question is whether the German command structure, in the autumn of 1944, with the Ardennes planning consuming the strategic reserve that the Saar front needs, with Hitler's command doctrine of holding every position without withdrawal, consuming the operational flexibility that a competent defensive management would employ to preserve the front's coherence under pressure, has any institutional mechanism for receiving an honest professional assessment of a deteriorating defensive position and responding to it with the operational decision that the assessment recommends. The evidence from the autumn of 1944, the series of corps and army commanders whose honest reports have been followed by their relief and replacement, with commanders whose reports are more compatible with the official optimism, suggests the answer is no. The German command structure has been answering this question all autumn, and its consistent answer is the relief of the man who reports honestly. November 1944. The LXXI Corps sector of the Saar front, where the autumn rain has been falling since October, in the steady and cold way of the Western German November, that the men in the forward positions, the German infantry in their bunkers and their fieldworks and their prepared defensive positions, are experiencing as the compounding physical misery of cold and wet, and the knowledge that the American positions across the line are being reinforced and resupplied, while the German positions are being maintained at the margin of what is sustainable. The defensive positions that the Corps has been holding since September have been converting from the prepared and organized defensive works that the Western Wall provides in the concrete bunkers and the tank obstacles of Germany's pre-war defensive construction into the forward positions that the American pressure has been pushing back from the Siegfried Line's outer works toward the main line of resistance. Von der Chevallerie is managing the specific and compounding problems of the understrength divisions in the specific and professional way of a corps commander who has accepted the resources he has been given and is extracting the maximum available defensive performance from them with the professional competence of a general whose assessment of what is possible is grounded in his honest assessment of what he actually has. His management tools are the professional quality of his divisional commanders, the competence that the German officer corps has been building since 1933, and that even the deteriorating conditions of the autumn of 1944 have not eliminated from the formations whose leadership continues to produce the professional performance that the material resources inadequacy makes increasingly difficult to sustain. The defensive value of the terrain whose concrete and whose water obstacles and whose ridge lines he is using with the professional skill of a commander who has been reading ground since the First World War, and the operational judgment that allows him to identify the positions where the American pressure is most likely to find the weak point, and to concentrate the limited available reserves at those points before the American assault makes the concentration too late to be effective. The 559th Volksgrenadier Division is holding the southern sector of the Corps' front with the specific and documented desperation of a formation whose replacement drafts have not been keeping pace with the casualties that the autumn fighting has been producing, whose artillery support has been constrained by the ammunition shortfalls, whose specific and documented cause is the Allied air interdiction of the supply routes from Germany's industrial heartland to the Western Front's depots. The division's regimental commanders are reporting to their divisional commander the condition of their battalions in the specific and honest language of professional soldiers who are telling their commander what their formations can and cannot do, and whose reports are assembling into the picture that von der Chevallerie is transmitting upward to OB West with the professional clarity of a commander who has decided that the accuracy of the report is more important than its palatability. The near failure in von der Chevallerie's professional management of the Saar front, the moment when the LXXE Corps' defensive line comes closest to the operational collapse that von der Chevallerie's November 2 report has been projecting as the consequence of the American pressure's continuation at the operational level, arrives in mid-November 1944, when the American 12th Corps renews its pressure with the specific and operational energy that the autumn's supply situation has been building toward. The Allied logistical systems accumulation of the fuel and ammunition, whose shortage had been constraining the American advance since September, since the Red Ball Express's capacity had been consumed by the competing claims of multiple corps and armies, whose combined demands had exceeded. The available supply has been progressing through October and early November to the point where the sustained offensive pressure that the 12th Corps' operational design has been projecting as the objective is now achievable with the material support that the operational plan requires. The 35th Infantry Division's assault on the fortified town of Metz and the surrounding fortress system, the siege that has been consuming the 8th Corps' resources since September, has concluded with the German garrison's surrender on November 18th, and the operational pressure on the Saar corridor is building as the Allied forces freed from the Metz operation begin reorienting toward the east. Von der Chevallerie's warnings about the front's condition are being confirmed by the operational situation in the most direct and costly way available. The American assault is finding the weak points that his divisional commanders have been identifying. The reserves whose commitment he has been requesting are not arriving in the form or the timing that the tactical situation requires, and the front line is moving in the direction that his professional assessment predicted it would move when the American pressure was sustained at the operational level. November 22, 1944. The crisis point in the LXXXI Corps sector's defense arrives when American forces from Eddy's 12th Corps pierce the German line near Falkmont and threaten to produce the breakthrough whose possibility von der Chevallerie has been documenting in his reports since November 2nd. The defensive position that the German forces have been holding through the autumn, at the cost that the divisional casualty returns have been documenting, is breached in the specific and visceral way of a defensive line whose material weakness the attacking force has found and exploited. The American infantry advancing through the mud of the Saar-Moselle Triangle's November fields, through the German wire and the German minefields, into the German positions whose defenders are fighting with the professional competence of soldiers who have been doing this since Normandy, but who are doing it with the material resources of a formation that is under-strength, under-supplied, and under-reinforced. The German counterattack that the defensive doctrine prescribes for the restoration of a lost position is executed with the reserves available, which are not the reserves that the operational situation requires, are the reserves of a corps that has been operating under strength for 3 months, and whose reserve pool has been depleted by every previous commitment whose cumulative effect is the specific and documented inadequacy that von der Chevallerie's November 2 report had been projecting as the front's fundamental weakness. The position is partially restored after the specific and costly fighting in the rain and the mud of the Falkmont sector, where the American and German infantry are engaging at the close ranges that the terrain and the weather are imposing, and where the quality of the individual soldier on both sides is being measured in the specific and permanent way of close combat, bodies in the ground, positions on the map. The breach is contained but not eliminated, and von der Chevallerie's report of November 2 has been confirmed in the most operationally direct and irreversible way possible. The front is not holding under the American pressure that the improved Allied supply situation has permitted, and the consequences of the front's failure to hold are exactly the consequences that the November 2 report projected. The legacy of General Kurt von der Chevallerie's November 2 report, the report that told Hitler the Saar front could not hold through winter, that transmitted upward through the German command chain the specific and documented professional assessment of a corps commander who had been watching his sector's defensive capability deteriorate for 3 months, and who had decided that the accurate description of that deterioration was the professional obligation whose discharge the report represented, is a legacy that operates in the historical record at the intersection of professional military honesty and institutional self-deception. It operates at the intersection that the German command structure in the autumn of 1944 has been navigating with increasing dysfunction as the gap between the front's actual condition and the official assessment of that condition has been widening with every month's deterioration of the German military's material position and with every commander who has been relieved for reporting the actual condition rather than the official assessment. Von der Chevallerie's report was accurate. His professional assessment of the LXXA Corps sector's defensive capability was the assessment that the divisional commanders' reports confirmed in the daily returns of the October and November fighting, that the casualty returns documented in the specific and accumulated numbers of the men lost and the positions yielded, that the ammunition shortage data supported in the specific and documented shortfalls whose operational effect the divisional artillery commanders were reporting in the restricted fire plans that the ammunition allocation required, and that the terrain's tactical analysis produced in the professional judgment of a commander who had been walking this ground and reading its defensive value and its defensive weakness for 3 months. He was right. The Saar front did not hold through winter in the way that OKW's planning had assumed it would. The American offensive that the autumn's supply accumulation enabled broke through the German defensive position in December and January in the specific and documented operational movement that the Allied command had been planning since November. And the Siegfried Line's defensive value, the value that OKW had been using as the basis of its assessment that the Western Front could be stabilized through the winter, and that the Ardennes offensive could be launched from a stable base, was consumed by the American operational pressure that von der Chevallerie's report had projected as the decisive test that the German defensive position would fail. Von der Chevallerie was relieved of command in late November 1944. The formal reason given in the command papers was the Corps sector's deteriorating defensive performance, the specific and documented operational justification that a military command system uses for the relief of a Corps commander whose sector has been under pressure and whose defensive position has been deteriorating. A justification that is simultaneously true in the narrow sense that the sector's performance has not met the standard the command has set, and misleading in the broader sense that the sector's performance has failed to meet the standard precisely because the conditions whose inadequacy von der Chevallerie's reports have been documenting are the conditions that the command's failure to reinforce has produced. The actual reason, documented in the command communications of the period and in the foreign military studies interviews conducted after the war with the German officers who were present in the command structure during this period, was the substance of his reports, the honest professional assessment of the defensive position's inadequacy that the German command structure in late 1944 was treating as an operational liability rather than as the operational intelligence that a functioning command system requires for the decisions whose quality depends on the quality of the information they are based on. He was replaced by a commander whose reports were more compatible with the optimism that the Ardennes planning required. The planning for the December 1944 offensive through the Ardennes that Hitler had been developing since September, and that OKW had been building the strategic reserve for through October and November, at the direct cost of the reinforcements that the Western Front's holding formations, including von der Chevallerie's LXXXE Corps, had been requesting and not receiving. The Ardennes planning required the Saar Front's stability through December, and the Saar Front's stability through December required the official assessment of the Saar Front's condition to be more optimistic than von der Chevallerie's honest professional assessment had been. The commander whose replacement of von der Chevallerie provided the more optimistic assessment performed the institutional function that the German command structure required, provided the reports that allowed OKW to proceed with the Ardennes planning on the assumption that the Saar Front would hold through the offensive period, an assumption that was partially correct for reasons that had less to do with the German defensive capability that the reports were describing than with the American operational focus that the Ardennes offensive was drawing north. The Ardennes offensive launched on December 16, 1944, deploying the reserve that OKW had been building through October and November in the specific and secret concentration whose assembly von der Chevallerie's requests for reinforcement had been competing against and losing. The Saar Front's stability during the Ardennes offensive period, the 6 weeks from December 16 to late January, when the Allied command's operational attention was consumed by the crisis in the Ardennes, was partially maintained, not because von der Chevallerie's assessment of the front's fundamental weakness was wrong, but because the American 12th Corps' attention was drawn north to the Ardennes crisis, and because the weather conditions that produced the Ardennes' tactical surprise also constrained the American operational capability on the Saar Front. When the Ardennes offensive failed, when Patton's Third Army had turned north and driven to Bastogne and broken the encirclement, and when the Allied operational attention returned to the Saar-Moselle sector in January 1945, the front moved in the direction that von der Chevallerie's November report had projected. What the November 2 report demonstrates, in the specific and professional assessment of what a corps commander's honest reporting costs, and what the institution's management of that honesty produces, when the institution's management tool is the replacement of the commander who reports honestly with the commander who reports what the institution prefers, is the specific and historically significant truth that the German command structure in 1944 had converted the management of bad news into a mechanism of institutional self-deception whose operational consequence was the systematic substitution of official optimism for professional assessment at every level of the command chain where the official optimism and the professional assessment diverged, and where the institutional pressure for the preferred assessment was strong enough to make the professional cost of the honest assessment too high for the individual commander to absorb without the institutional consequence that von der Chevallerie absorbed. Von der Chevallerie wrote what was true. He was replaced by someone who would write what was preferred. The Saar Front failed in the way he predicted, and the lesson that his professional honesty and its institutional consequences leave in the historical record is not a lesson about the Saar Front's specific tactical situation in November 1944. It is a lesson about what happens to any military institution when it begins managing its information system to produce the reports that the institutional leadership prefers rather than the reports that the operational reality produces, and about the specific and inevitable operational failure that the substitution of preferred information for accurate information always eventually causes. The failure comes exactly where the honest report said it would, at exactly the time the honest report predicted, in exactly the form the honest report described, because the honest report was honest, and the front does not care what the optimistic report said.